All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Professor A.J. Nolte, who is a professor at Regent University as well as the director of the Institute for Israel Studies there, joining us to discuss the topic of the shifting dynamics between Islamism and evangelicals. Of course, during this discussion, we welcome any questions from the audience, which you can ask by using either the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Riverside window or by using the chat function inside of YouTube or any of our social media platforms. With that, I will introduce Professor Nolte. Good to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So just to kind of dive in here, for people who are in the audience who don't follow the same topic and don't really follow this world, can you give us sort of a brief crash course overview of some of the recent dynamics between Islamism and evangelicals?
Yeah, so let's start with a little bit of definitions when we're talking about evangelicals because it's not necessarily always intuitive. So we're talking about evangelical Christians. We're talking about generally Protestant background Christians who have a heavy emphasis on um, the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible, heavy emphasis on evangelism, and tend to take seriously the idea of a personal relationship with God. Um, And so they would be defined by a couple of core theological beliefs, um, emphasis on inerrancy of Scripture, desire for personal relationship with God, and sort of a born again experience, the importance of proclaiming the faith and sort of bringing the gospel to those who are not believers, and oftentimes they're often or they're tied in with a more sort of contemporary style of worship, although that's not necessarily guaranteed. Some estimates place evangelicals in the U.S. context around 25% of the U.S. population. When people talk about evangelicals in the U.S., they're often talking about specifically white evangelicals, although there is a growing, important evangelical population in the Hispanic Latino community in the United States, and then also some in the Asian and African American communities as well. So just diagnostics within the United States. Globally, I would say numbers vary depending on how you slice it. But evangelical Christians, particularly those with a charismatic background, and if I use the term charismatic, those are Christians that believe in sort of the presence of miraculous spiritual gifts in the present day. If you're more familiar with the Muslim background, you could think of these guys as a little bit like Sufis, although not as well organized, and both might bristle at the comparison, but there are reasons for it. And that trend is growing rapidly in parts of the global south, and that's going to impact our conversation today. So if we're talking about recent dynamics, there's three key points, really maybe four even key points that I want to emphasize. One, first key point. Traditionally, evangelicals have been very supportive of the state of Israel for a variety of theological reasons, centering around the idea that the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is part of God's redemptive work in history. For some of them, that's connected to end times. For some of them, that's not. But this is something that actually goes back to the English Reformation as a theological strand that's present in these Protestant churches. So that gives them a certain, colors their approach. Second, you have the evangelical tendency toward, as they would say, spreading the gospel or conversion, which has led to some clashes with Islam, which is a proselytizing religion, but it's a proselytizing religion that's not necessarily open to others coming in and then proselytizing Muslims. So that's led to some historical conflicts. And then you also have the fact that there are, you've got very strong emphasis on the Bible as the central organizing principle. And Islamists will say that biblical revelation is certainly, most Muslims would say biblical revelation is superseded by the Quran. That's going to cause another theological flashpoint. So historically, I would say there is a high degree of wariness and hostility toward certainly Islamic extremism. And that catalyzed in the several decades preceding 9/11 around two issues. One was, of course, Israel, and the other was the global persecution of Christians. This is something that became important to evangelicals during the Cold War because it was a major issue in the Eastern Bloc and the Communist Bloc. But then after the Cold War, the focus started to pivot, and they started to see a lot of that sort of persecution and restriction on Christians in Muslim worlds. So that's the historical backdrop to that. Also, the global South growth is important. Demographically, the evangelical world has been shifting from a European and American center to a center that's in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia. And that's just a demographic shift we've seen really consolidating over the past 50 years, which means that increasingly evangelicals are seeing their co-religionists in a position and a posture where they are facing Islam directly. In some areas, that facing has actually led to positive interactions. But of course, as we've seen the spread of global Islamic extremism into some of those areas, they're coming up against evangelicals, and the borders have been fractious, I think is a good way of putting it. So those are the main dynamics. At the same time, evangelicals have not been immune to some of the tendencies that we've seen in secular and even other religious universities as well, which is to say, as critical theory has started to gain hold, it has made some inroads into American evangelical institutions, and this is leading to a different perception of Islamic extremism. The Islamic extremists have in many ways, and this is probably not unfamiliar to your audience, portrayed themselves as an anti-colonial religion. And this has put evangelicals on the back foot because then they are often cast in the role of being colonialists in both in their support for Israel and in their support for these Christian communities. And so those that are more open to these critical perspectives have, I would say, kind of been put on the back foot and really have shied away from some of those traditional evangelical emphases. So things are shifting in a lot of ways. But the core DNA, I would say, of evangelicals makes them both hostile to and resistant to, in a lot of ways, the impact of Islamic extremism.
Now, thank you. Now, you touched on something that I did want to get to here. Now, you're a professor at a Christian university, and you mentioned these shifting dynamics of what it means to be evangelical in a sense, and how it's
Right.
kind of shifted with regards to what you just described there. Now, in my personal experience in university, I took a course. It was a history course at my liberal arts college on the history of Islam in the Middle East, and there was a book. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the author, but the book was called "The Case for a Islamo-Christian Society."
Yes, I think it's Richard Bullier was the author.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, that
yeah.
sounds about right. And all I could all I could think while I was reading it and doing this coursework is it seems to me that a lot of these Islamists and a lot of people are trying to hijack this strand inside of Christianity and inside of evangelical faith, and exploit the fact that in Islam, Christ was a prophet and Christ was this and that, and they'll use these to make these arguments, and in this case of this book, completely erase the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian and replace it with Islam.
Mhm.
How do you see that play out in your university, by contrast?
Regent is about as resistant to that as it possibly could be. We have a deep DNA of support for Israel and also support for the Jewish people, both at home and in our local area. And so, I mean, Regent has in its statement of purpose, and the Robertson School has in its statement of purpose, which is the school of government where I teach, the Judeo-Christian roots of civilization. And so I think that aspect At Regent in particular, there's a lot of resistance to that. Matter of fact, the Israel Institute that I lead here was created after October 7th, and sort of in direct contravention to a lot of the things that are happening on campuses. But Regent is probably an exception among most evangelical schools in the United States today. Not all of them, and I would say not even most of them, are as bad as some of the stuff that we've seen at the Ivy Leagues and even some other large public universities. But there are some that are more tilted in that direction, and there are a lot that are just sort of neutral, that are avoiding that topic. So, if you were to go to some of the more, some of the universities that have been affected by this a little bit more, they would be familiar with the Islamo-Christian argument. There would be, yes, emphases in sort of minimizing the differences between Christianity and Islam. You would see that in a lot of places. And they've really taken on board a couple of ideas. One, which is from religious studies, is the idea that Christians and Muslims essentially worship the same God. Now, this is sort of really actually taking the Islamic side of a debate that has existed since the beginning of Islam among Christians and Muslims, which is to say that, as you said, Muslims will say, well, Jesus is a prophet and his message is the same message of the Quran. Okay. But Christians have said, no, actually, we believe in a Trinitarian God who is one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is a very different conception of God than the Islamic conception of God. Also, there's a lot of DNA from the Jewish Hebrew Bible in Christianity, particularly with respect to God's relationship with man, where Christians will say that that human beings are made in the image of God. Traditionally in Islam, it's not phrased in that way. There's more of an emphasis on the sovereignty and supremacy of God, and that humanity is the highest among God's creatures, but not necessarily made in his image. It seems like a very subtle philosophical distinction, but I would point to the work of Stephen Prothero, who's a scholar of religion. His book is God is Not One. And Prothero points out that while to the outsider it seems like the important thing about religion are the common moral values they teach, the reality is to those actually in those different religious communities, the theological differences are really important. And so that's one idea. The other idea that you'll often hear in these places, like I said, is the idea that Islam is an anti-colonial religion and Christianity is a colonial religion. I've been alarmed by the degree to which many evangelicals are adopting that notion. There are two problems with it. One, it's false. Historically, of course, it all who's colonial depends on when you start the date of the colonialism, and also the idea that evangelicals were colonial elides actually the history of evangelical missionaries, many of whom across the world were some of the most effective critics of the policies of colonial governments, particularly where they prohibited proselytization, but also were abusive to local populations. And there's a lot of really good research on this. So first of all, evangelicals are erasing their own history in that sense. But it also puts Islam in a unique position vis-a-vis this sort of binary that we've seen so often from critical theory of being the oppressed religion. And that elides the really complicated dynamics that we see in many of the Christian-Muslim conflicts that are happening around the world in many of the borders. And it's not always a straightforward picture the other way either, where it's always sort of, the Christians are being victimized, but certainly it's not a situation where, oh, well, these are just people that are pushing back against colonial oppression, which is the narrative that so often comes about. So I have some concerns about the direction some of those schools are going, and I think a lot of it comes down to a call to action for evangelicals that I have often made in my teaching at Regent, which is we have got to have more evangelicals that are thoroughly trained in an objective understanding of Islam. And unfortunately, one of the challenges with that is it's really hard to find that objective understanding of Islam at many of the training courses and programs that you can go to in Middle East studies today.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you say that, of course, your university is very resistant to a lot of these sorts of kind of fluffy understandings of Islam and Islamism. Uh, how would you say has the adoption of woke ideology inside of all these universities, even by some evangelical institutions, affected their historical support for Israel and affected their views on Islamism?
It's very concerning in both of those directions. I would say the woke ideology is the camel's nose under the tent, to use an analogy, because what it does is it sort of the woke take for granted that Christians are white and that Christians are oppressors, in the same way that they take for granted that Jews are white and Jews are oppressors. And you wouldn't really pick up on this in a lot of secular universities because it's so taken for granted. But as you start looking at the way woke ideology narrates the history of Christianity, it is extremely Eurocentric. It is extremely centered on American racial paradigms and experiences. It is completely and utterly ignorant of the history of Christianity for 2,000 years outside of Western Europe. The woke are both ignorant of and incurious about the history of Christianity in those places. And certainly the history of Christianity in the East, in the Middle East and beyond, where Christians, for most of their history, lived under Islamic empires. Whether you want to call it Islamic imperialism, as Ephraim Karsh does or not, is up to you. But undeniably, they're subjects of Islamic empires, and their fate is contingent on being useful to and submitting to those empires. And so that history of being essentially a colonized people for most of Christian history is completely elided by the woke because they're so focused on white Western European Christians. What it also does is it elides the present, where, to quote the historian Philip Jenkins, the average evangelical Christian is a single female in Nigeria living on less than $1 a day. He said that in 2006. Those trends have intensified. And so it wasn't true in the past, and it's not true today, but it is a widespread perception. Those sensitive to the narratives that are spread about the Jews in Israel will notice a similar trend. That the Jews are narrated into the box of white oppressors, and it's equally false, was equally false historically, is equally false today about the state of Israel. And so it's actually a very similar process. The difference being that while many Jewish Americans and certainly many Israelis have started to push back against this, evangelicals at a lot of these universities have absolutely no defense to this attack from the left because they are themselves not conversant with this history. They are themselves starting from a position of apologizing for Christian history and not really understanding it very well. And as such, they have really no defense against these very challenging assertions. And there's a good argument, but you have to actually make it.
Well, you raise a good point. The most obvious example for me seems to be the fact that while this war between Israel and Hamas has been going on after October 7th, everyone is very quick to call it a war of genocide and
Right.
oppression, and they seem to be very silent about the fact that there are Christians in the global South
Yes.
and in places like Africa that are actually undergoing things like genocides and massacres. And I think it goes into what you were saying about people thinking that Christianity and in this case even Judaism are white, religions of conquest. But on that note, are there any, or excuse me, how might the shifting geographic center of evangelicalism from the U.S. to the global South impact global religious freedom movements?
I think it's going to have a huge impact. First of all, um, evangelicals in the United States are becoming aware of the explosive growth in the global South. And eventually, I think, getting to the position where they will start listening to voices coming from the global South. And the picture that those voices are painting about their relationship with Islam and the challenges they face in Muslim majority countries or in countries on the border is very different. It's very different than what's being inculcated in some of the more woke leaning evangelical universities. And so I think that's going to have an impact. And I would hope that will have an impact moving forward. Second, I think it's hard to say that religious freedom is going to be anything but a front burner issue for plugged in evangelicals moving forward politically. If, in fact, that identity is something that is important to you, it's hard to miss that the vast majority of your co-religionists now are in areas where religious freedom is fragile at best, non-existent at worst. And that makes it a front burner issue in a way that it's been an important issue in the past. I think it's going to be increasingly centralized. And then the final thing is one huge gap in knowledge, both here in the United States and more broadly, and even among evangelicals, is the attitude of these global South churches toward Israel, which I think is something that I'm eager to dig into in my own studies over the next couple of years. There's an assumption, and you even see this in some of the book, the way the book talks about sort of the global North and the global South. And I read something recently, this idea of, the global South has this idea for, this vision of racial and gender equality. And I just started laughing because I'm in the Anglican Church myself, and all of the conservative Anglicans provinces that are saying no to not only wokeism but also to changing traditional church teachings about marriage and sexuality and marriage and family. They're all in the global South. And so our co-religionists there are much more theologically conservative in a lot of ways than we are in the United States, to a degree that sometimes makes a lot of white evangelical Americans uncomfortable. But they also have that very strong biblical sense, which is going to change the way they relate to Israel. And so as evangelicalism grows in places like Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, does this eventually lead to shifts in those countries, relationships with Israel, as these growing evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic movements start saying to their governments, hey, we want you to actually act in a way that's consistent with our values, not necessarily that's consistent with the values of, permanent ambassadors to the UN who've been there for, 30 years and have lost touch with where the people are. So that's a phenomenon, I think, to really watch over the next, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, thank you. Now, no, not to jump around too much here from topic to topic, as our time is a bit limited here. But you were just in Israel for some time, and you
Yes, it
happened to
was.
be there while this round of conflict between Israel and Iran was kind of popping off. Um, how significant? You talked about this before we went live, and I was very interested to hear. How significant is the growth of the underground evangelical church in Iran, and what potential impact could it have on this regime?
Yeah, first of all, it was surreal being there during the war. Those who've not been um, to Israel in that time of conflict, which I hadn't before this, the difference between Israelis going about their business during the day and then what happens at night when the sirens go off. I was in Jerusalem, and I was in the old city of Jerusalem, which is a very safe area this go around. But it was still kind of stark to see that. In terms of your question about the church in Iran, um, estimates vary widely in terms of the actual size and scope of the Christian population. I would hesitate to put a number on it because obviously it's not really safe to declare yourself a Christian if you come from a Muslim background in the Islamic Republic of Iran today. What we do know is that there has been substantial growth in the underground church via satellites, via the internet, via dreams and visions is a common story that you're hearing. You can credit that or not, but I'm just telling you, empirically, people are saying that on a regular basis in Iran, that this is how they're finding out about Jesus, and so the impact, I think, could be quite significant. We don't exactly know, and it will be hard to really scope that out and unless there is regime change. But there's a lot of evangelicals that are watching very closely and carefully, because for people that follow the trends of the growth of evangelical communities globally, Iran is one of those areas where everybody gets really excited about what might possibly be happening beneath the surface, and about what could explosively happen if the Iranian regime eventually is removed. Will there be sort of a real growth in that area? I will say there is a trend, at least a micro trend, of folks who have been under Islamist regimes for a long period of time, becoming disenchanted with Islam, and some of them end up becoming Christian, some of them end up going to more moderate strands of Islam, some of them end up becoming religiously completely unaffiliated. And so the assumption that if the Islamic Republic and the clerical establishment falls, that you're going to get just another Islamically inflected regime after that, I don't necessarily know if that holds up, because I think there's a lot happening under the surface that could change the religious demographic picture of Iran once we're able to get clear numbers. And I'm hopeful that that'll happen in the next couple of years, because, from a geopolitical perspective, I think the Islamic Republic no longer being on the board would be beneficial for a lot of us, for Israel, for the West, and for the Iranian people as well.
I'm hopeful for that as well. Now, I'm going to go to a question here from the audience. Thomas asks, a wild card of sorts is the new Catholic Pope, replacing the South American Pope Francis. Leo, born in the US, but having ministered in Peru and around the world, might bring a different perspective to the Abrahamic religions. Any insights of what direction the Catholic Church will take?
I would watch who he appoints and where. Um, I think many papal watchers were hoping for a pope who had more direct experience with Islam to be elected. Leo does not have that direct experience because he's been mostly in a Latin American and then North American context. But there are some voices that he could rely on for that, who could be very interesting. One of the most intriguing figures in the Roman Catholic Church right now, and a guy who was a dark horse for Pope, is Cardinal Pizzavalla, Pier Battista Pizzavalla, who is the cardinal protector of the Latin churches in Jerusalem, of which, by the way, I can tell you from recent experience, there are a whole lot. He's interesting because on the one hand, he has a deep care for those Roman Catholic churches in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are really struggling from demographic hemorrhaging for complex reasons that have a lot to do with some Islamic supremacist elements in the Palestinian Authority and certainly in Hamas, and also the challenges of living in a conflict zone and opportunities elsewhere. But also, Pizzavalla has a master's degree in Jewish studies from Hebrew University, and offered to exchange himself for the hostages after October 7th. And so he's somebody who has a lot of credibility to speak on those issues. I wouldn't be surprised if Pope Leo relies on him for that. Francis, I think, sometimes was more uncritical and unskeptical about some of our Muslim interlocutors as Christians than I would have preferred. And so hopefully what we'll see with Leo is a little bit more sort of prudential caution, and not necessarily taking at face value some of the folks that are maybe saying that they're open to ecumenical dialogue when actually they're trying to take things in a less positive direction. The last point that I'll make about that is, when you're looking at the papacy as a diplomatic and a religio-political institution, you also have to pay close attention to the Vatican bureaucracy, and particularly the Vatican bureaucracy around the Secretary of State's office. And that bureaucracy is very Eurocentric in the sense that it's very similar to the bureaucratic foreign ministries of a lot of European nations. And so will Leo actually try to reform that and get people that have maybe more of a global instead of a European Union-centric view of the interests of the Roman Catholic Church? I think that's one to watch as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I am afraid we are all out of time for this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and give us your insights.
Happy to do it.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners who want to follow more of your work, is there somewhere where you might direct them to if they want to read more of your writings or follow what you do?
Absolutely. So a lot of my work right now is focused on the Israel Institute. So you can find us by searching Regent University's Israel Institute. We also have a podcast, very cleverly titled the Israel Institute Podcast. And I'll occasionally also write for Regent Center for Christian Thought and Action, and for a number of other conservative outlets. and places like that. But the Israel Institute is probably the main place where I would my stuff can be found.
Well, fantastic. For those watching later on the YouTube video, I will be sure to add that into the video description below, so you can click that and you can follow AJ's work there. And for the rest of our viewers and listeners, please join us on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. Hopefully, the audio is fixed this time around, and you will actually be able to hear what Ashley Perry has to say. As always, we thank you all again for your viewership and your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.